As you can see, I have my Ohio gear on. I got my Cleveland Browns merch and my Ohio State sweatshirt. I did not go to Ohio State, but this was a gift from an uncle of mine who did, because I hail from a clan of Buckeyes. And the reason I'm talking about this is because I'm going to be discussing a new show about one of 8 presidents, American presidents, to hail from Ohio. 8 of them. Weirdly enough, it hasn't produced a president since the 1920s in Warren G. Harding. You would think that they would have gotten a president in there since it's been a swing state for so long. Hey, maybe we'll get a new Ohio president pretty soon. Kill me. Okay, Ohio lore aside, I'm talking about the new Netflix docudrama, Death by Lightning, which is about President James Garfield and the madman who assassinated him, Charles Guiteau.
I made a vow to end the rot in our party.
President James Garfield!
All I want is to be a part of it. My name is Charles Guiteau.
What line of work are you in?
Politics.
This is my first time ever talking about a historical series or movie, anything like that. But if you know me, then you know I'm actually a pretty big history nerd. I'm not a historian or an amateur historian or anything, but I love history. I geek out about American history a lot. One of my favorite shows in particular was Gaslit, that show about the Watergate scandal. That seemed to go under people's radar. I'm not sure why. It was a star-studded cast. I guess people maybe have lost interest in Watergate. I don't know. Well, if you're not interested in seeing a movie or a show about Watergate, it's hard to imagine that you might want to watch a show about President James Garfield, one of the more obscure presidents in American history, probably because he was shot and killed just 3 months into his only term in the office. And despite my affection for history, the most I've really known about Garfield is this Sam O'Nella video about the really wild story, the, stranger than fiction story of Charles Guiteau. I mean, James Garfield isn't even the most iconic Garfield in American history anymore. He's the only president to be outfamed by a cartoon cat. But because of the crazy story of Charles Guiteau, and because of the bizarre circumstances surrounding Guiteau's motivations and his relationship to Garfield, I definitely wanted to check out Death by Lightning, especially when I saw the cast. First up, we have Matthew Macfadyen, Succession's Matthew Macfadyen playing Guiteau. Hard to get more perfect casting in my book. Matthew Macfadyen has this perfect bumbling sleaze from Succession that I thought would make him a perfect Guiteau, especially because I thought we could actually get some pathos out of his portrayal. He's really good at finding the patheticness, the raw, pathetic nature of these really loathsome, wormy characters. So yeah, I watched it and I loved it. It was 4 episodes and I could have watched 10, 20. The really pleasant surprise and the thing that I thought would be a real test of this show's quality would be not just dramatizing the salacious details of Charles Guiteau's descent into madness, but teaching me, enlightening me about the man who was James Garfield. It was to the point that I thought the Guiteau stuff was starting to get in the way of what I thought was a really juicy, gripping, and moving political drama. Michael Shannon plays President Garfield, and his performance is so touching, and he brings Garfield to life in such a warm way, a personable way, and with so much gravitas that, I don't know, James Garfield might be one of my favorite presidents. He's certainly one of the most interesting men to ever be elected president, for sure. Now, I'm not well-versed in the history of James Garfield or this time period at all, so I'm not going to scrutinize historical details. And I really don't know what the real James Garfield was like. But this portrait of him and the moment in time that he really embodied, because this was at a really fractured point in time for American history and the history of the Republican Party. There was a civil war in the Republican Party at this point between the stalwarts, which were the Republicans aligned with the Civil War general turned President Ulysses S. Grant, who kind of embodied machine politics, had a lot of corruption scandals at the time that really ruined his reputation to a lot of folks. And I think they're called half-breeds, which was a wing led by this really interesting character in the show, played really wonderfully by Bradley Whitford, James Blaine. And they were the reformers of the Republican Party. They wanted to, for lack of a better turn of phrase, drain the swamp from Washington, from their party. And they were met by a really formidable opponent in all that in the character, the real person of Roscoe Conkling. And James Garfield's place in all this is, and this is depicted in the show, it's one of my favorite things from the show, he goes to the convention just to give a speech nominating the brother of General Sherman, that's right, of General Sherman's march, and his speech, which was a call to action to his fellow Republicans to stand up to the machine in their own party and to deliver a government for the people. That speech was so powerful and so effective that it got him the nomination without him really trying. He wasn't there to get nominated to be president. He was just there to deliver a speech, but the party was so fractured that he became the compromise candidate, the consensus candidate, and he managed to win. And while you have this happening, you see Guiteau's really weird, strange journey going from being a convicted felon, leaving a sex cult, stealing money from his poor sister, and then accidentally crossing paths with Garfield and the Republican Party, and getting deluded into thinking that he was a part of the campaign to get Garfield elected. And this is something that's a part of the dramatic arc of the show. I don't know how much this was the case for the real Guiteau. Both saw themselves as embodying the American dream, right? Guiteau was very inspired by Garfield, thought he had a kinship with Garfield, and thought that he'd be working for the man one day after Garfield won. Basically, it's the 1880s version of Stan. Hey, Jim, I wrote you, but you still ain't calling. Matthew Macfadyen is basically doing his Succession performance here, and it's as entertaining as I'd hoped. There's this one wide shot, this crowd shot at the end of the first episode where you just see him cheering at the announcement of Garfield's nomination, and he just goes, "Oh, wow!" This forced, contrived, chipper energy. He's such a grifter and a con man that he's grifting himself. And in that one wide shot, Matthew Macfadyen's performance is so magnetic that that stood out to me in a whole sea of extras. There's Matthew Macfadyen giving another great performance.
Eat shit, I'm a taxpayer.
Now, something that I want to comment on is that his performance of Guiteau differs from my understanding of what the real Guiteau was like. Like, this version of Guiteau is almost adorable. They wring a lot of comedy out of him trying to insert himself into Garfield's world and hype himself up as a legitimate politician or person of influence, and those are some of the most entertaining sequences of the show. But the real Guiteau struck me as far more deranged and dangerous. Looking at this photo of him, he reminds me more of Charles Manson, which differs from the performance that Macfadyen is giving. I think there could have been a real psychological thriller, almost something like Taxi Driver, that could have been done if they really zeroed in on that aspect of Guiteau. But that also might have distracted from the themes and the real meat of this story, which is not about some crazed lunatic who's stalking a president. Guiteau is not the villain of this show. He's the man who killed Garfield, but the villain of the show is Roscoe Conkling, who embodies establishment politics, I guess, in the way that I think a lot of people just imagine establishment politicians to be like. Exactly. A man who just wants power for power's sake and will do anything to get people out of his way. And the power struggle between Garfield and Conkling is what kept me binging this show, and is what I think gave me the most to think about. Roscoe Conkling is played by Shea Wingham, who also played G. Gordon Liddy in that show I mentioned, Gaslit. Here's where I have to talk about maybe the biggest plus of this show. The beards. The beards, the hair that is glued onto these actors' faces. I felt like I was watching like a fantasy show or something, seeing some of the hairdos on these guys. And Roscoe Conkling, best example, he looks like the devil. He looks like he has the devil's horns growing out of his head. And believe it or not, that's what Roscoe Conkling really looked like. Now, I'm going to take a beat here to talk about the real Roscoe Conkling, because in the brief research that I did, I think there are more nuances to this guy. He was a radical Republican, meaning he was radically anti-slavery. He started a petition to get women the right to vote, decades before they would actually be granted that right in the late 1910s. I'm not saying that excuses any of the things he really did to make politics so corrupt. He basically built a criminal empire from within Washington, D.C. But something that I've really started to appreciate about history and just about life in general is that you can be the protagonist of one story and the antagonist of another. And in the story To End the Spoils System, he was absolutely the arch-villain of that whole saga, and that's depicted pretty perfectly here. I do think there are a few too many, let's say, indulgences with how over-the-top Conkling is in this show, and we spend maybe too much time with him just doing the same thing, barking orders, belittling people. It started to feel like an episode of Veep, but a bit more tedious than that, because this was a show that I was really invested in, and Veep is obviously a satire. And one of the most delightful performances that I have to call out is Nick Offerman as Chester A. Arthur. If I knew next to nothing about Jim Garfield going into this show, I knew absolutely nothing about Chet Arthur. I don't even think I knew he was the vice president who took over after Garfield's assassination. But he was, and he has the biggest arc in this show and in real life, as I understand. He was a thug for Conkling and the Republican machine, the Grant machine. I don't know if it was really this bad in real life, but he's literally shown beating people up like an enforcer, taking people's money, putting bags over people's head, and kidnapping them in the dark of night. In that way, it reminded me a lot of Gangs of New York, the way that machine politics was really just a face of gangland warfare and street crime. But he went from being a total thug to being Garfield's VP because that was a political maneuver. They needed the support of the New York machine, even as they were trying to fight it. So he was a compromised VP in his own way. And then, as has happened sometimes in history, the office of the presidency and the model of Garfield's leadership actually did move Chester Arthur enough to break away from machine politics, stand up to Conkling, and as president actually effectively ended the spoils system, which was a system he helped to build from the ground up, and he hurt a lot of people doing it. I was debating whether or not the show earned his 180 turn as much as we see it. Obviously, this is based on history, so it's like, how much can you really critique these things? These things really happened. You can't say it's hard to imagine when it really happened. I just think they played Arthur up too much for laughs sometimes in those first 2 episodes. They really play him like a drunk and a fool, and then they do try to bring out this other side to him. But I think there could have been a little more finesse in that department. But still, Nick Offerman, we instantly like this guy because it's Nick Offerman. He looks like this. And for as many scenes as we have of him intimidating people, being a dick to people, we see him being in good cheer, partying, having a good time, actually being friends with Gateau and being maybe the only person to really give him the time of day. Their dynamic actually reminded me of something interesting. It reminded me of the movie City Lights, the Charlie Chaplin movie City Lights. Because in that movie, the tramp befriends this rich guy who gets wasted every night. And when this guy's wasted, he becomes the tramp's best friend. He is so generous, so giving, wants to party it up with Charlie Chaplin all night. But when he's sober, he
basically forgets all about the tramp and has no use for him. That was a really similar dynamic to Guiteau and Arthur's relationship. Don't know if it was like that in real life, but that was a very interesting element in the show because it plants that seed of delusion for Guiteau to think that maybe he has a shot of having some kind of place in the Garfield administration. One of the hardest things to watch in the show was not just the scene of Garfield getting shot, which was really well handled, but the weeks that he spent being treated by this quack doctor who was poking around his insides with unsanitized equipment. So Guiteau actually did not kill Garfield. Technically, this doctor did because of the infection that he gave Garfield. Garfield would have survived the bullet, actually. That's just one of those details that really highlights the stranger-than-fiction nature of this whole saga. One of the most needless and pointless acts of political violence ever, and it could have all been for nothing if there was just a proper medical examiner on site. But as sad and as dour as this show made me feel, yeah, I did feel a slight amount of hope because there are good people out there who are compelled to help others. But it's a reminder that good causes are always worth fighting for. I mean, you might get a Netflix show made about you.